Hi, this is Lenny Pfeffer, President of the Dorchester County Council, and you're listening to the Maryland Association of Counties Conduit Street Podcast, the source for news and notes on Maryland's policy and politics.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson, and today we have a very special guest, a returning guest. Walter Olson is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. He's a familiar figure both in national policy circles and right here in Maryland. We have been very fortunate to have Walter at our conferences and events, and once we shifted gears a bit during the pandemic, he was one of our first remote guests. So thanks so much for coming back with us, Walter. It's really good to hear from you.
I'm delighted to be back. Thanks for having me on.
So Walter, back in 2020, I think Kevin was right. You might have been our very first guest when we decided we could go ahead and record these using the marvels of remote meetings and so forth. But we were happy to have you on and offer some perspective on what at the time in the sort of beginning and intermediate stages of the health pandemic, they felt like extraordinary things that governments were doing in responding to the health situation. People were, concerned about being out in public, and there are a lot of things going on that were interesting public policy issues, as well as just everybody making do their best with the pandemic. I know, your point of view with Cato and otherwise as a writer and thinker has been towards the hands-off perspective, the more libertarian perspective. And that I thought was an interesting point of view as the government was engaging in an awful lot of things that felt with human behavior. So I guess, here we are, we're in something of a different phase of this pandemic, even though maybe caseloads are getting worrisome a bit again. We're past the large-scale emergency declarations, some of the extraordinary authority that some governments were taking. We wanted to touch base with you and talk about a number of things, but I'd like to start with that same topic. If you have any reflections on where public policy went and where we've landed now that we've kind of made it through a few years of the COVID-19 crisis and doing a number of things on the fly to respond to it. You have a thought there?
Yeah. When we talked last time, no one really knew where it was headed because like other viruses, this one evolves, and no one knew how successful humanity would be in developing countermeasures or whether the virus would be so good at mutating and perhaps becoming more deadly. I think looking back in retrospect, I feel pretty good about the recommendations that I made. And I always speak kind of on two registers, the policy and the legal, because a lot of what I follow is what the courts are doing. And I'll get to that in a second. But the rest of it is the government following good policy or not? Now, historically, if you look at other serious pandemics, there wasn't all that much the government was doing during COVID that it hadn't tried to do in the early ones. Things like controls on public assembly, controls on public buildings and transit and so forth. These were familiar from various earlier epidemics. Part of the uncertainty that we had was in the early stages, we weren't quite sure how it was spreading. And looking back, we weren't quite sure how it was spreading. And so a lot of things were tried, like controls on outdoor activities, that pretty soon began to look, wait a minute, why were we having all those rules on outdoor activities when they hardly ever spread the disease? But starting out, we knew very little. And looking back with some perspective, we see that New York City was very, very hard hit, probably had something to do with the density in the subway. And that gets me to my first point, which is that there is no single recommendation for what governments should do. Cities simply are faced with a different set of issues than rural areas. And you see this in Maryland. Maryland, I wrote about several times, Governor Hogan was right around in the middle of the pack as far as the stringency of what he put in, but especially on education, but also to some extent on other things. He recognized that Maryland is a decentralized and diverse state. And so you had different policies in Montgomery County I'm going to let another siren go by here. Sorry, I live on Main Street with the fire department. So Governor Hogan recognized that Maryland is this diverse and decentralized state, and particularly on school policy, the various county school systems behave differently. Montgomery behaved differently from some of the rural ones. And you also saw that to some extent on what the county boards of health did. Now, I happen to think this is well suited to the conditions of our state, which has such differences from region to region, and also that it's one reason why people should stay humble when talking about national COVID policy, is because it's very clear that things that New York City and New Jersey may have needed at one point were probably never necessary in some other places. Looking back, we have more perspective. The long closures of schools look like more of a mistake than a lot of people thought at the time. We see the learning delays, we see the socialization delays. Those are real hard costs. I'm inclined to be in the camp that says, try to learn lessons and move on, because some of those decisions were made before we really knew the generational profile of COVID, the fact that children don't seem to spread it very much. A lot of honest mistakes were made by people who were trying to read the science as best as they could.
There's that old concept of the smaller level of governments have opportunities to be the laboratories of democracy. And maybe a little bit of that played out where rural parts of America, I mean, yeah, we have this, Maryland is America in miniature, and we saw it even in our geographically small state. We've got western counties that are effectively Appalachian in nature and extremely rural. Big parts of the Eastern Shore, similarly very rural and agricultural. The center part of the state, very much built up and developed, much more dense, more public transportation and so forth. So having different reactions probably did make sense. But I think the philosophy of look at what we've done and learn from it and be as prepared as possible in the event we have to make similar decisions again is well taken by our leaders, I think.
And I understand psychologically the desire to just put it behind us and never relive some of the extreme unpleasantness, especially with people who had dying relatives they couldn't visit and so forth. And maybe to some extent we can, but people concerned with policy should be trying to learn those next lessons, because there are going to be more pandemics. There just are.
Absolutely. And I think, Walter, a lot of the frustration, at least on my end, and I think for a lot of folks in county government, was trying to cut through the noise, right? And this became so political so fast that I wonder if a lot of people's outrage was just driven by, Team Red or Team Blue, and they were just following along. And again, it was so politicized that I think a lot of people had bad information. And so, as you know, once that spreads, it's hard to stop it. And so I'm interested, too, in your perspective of, what did you learn in terms of, the spread of misinformation, and maybe how we can rein that in and really find those trusted sources in the future and make sure that we don't have all this bad information going around, which leads to other things, including people dying, unfortunately.
You've raised such a big issue because, of course, I spend a lot of my time writing about the First Amendment and the legal protections for free speech. And I am a huge admirer of what America has done with the First Amendment, but I have to admit, my heart sank when I saw the misinformation about vaccines, when I saw opinion turning around based on, exactly as you say, the red-blue polarity. They would be reading completely different news sources. And I speak about the Republicans because I've spent so much of my life on the center right, but you see a whole community moving further away from understanding issues of transmission and therapy, and particularly vaccines, based on the team thinking and the thinking that an elite is trying to hide facts from us and all the rest of it. Now, and there was error on multiple sides. The question of the origin in China was, suppressed is too strong a word, but there was this big effort to discourage speculation about exactly why it had come out of Wuhan, China, and that also, took us further away from the goal, which is to dispassionately understand science. I am proud of Maryland, and I'm corny about this, but I'm proud of the fact that Maryland has, by some measures, more higher education in its population than any other state. But specifically on this issue, it has all this presence in vaccines and in genuinely rigorous medical research. And so I smiled at many times about how, even though Maryland was not immune from some of this thinking, we had a head start from the fact that we do have an awful lot of biomedical expertise in our state.
Absolutely. I'm also proud of Maryland and how Maryland handled this. And I think the big takeaway, as you said earlier, was that, don't forget, but try and learn for the next one and do things better. A lot of people were making decisions on the fly and everyone did the best they could. We could talk about this for hours and hours, Walter, but I do want to get into election policy. And I know you have been very active thinking and writing about elections policy. And it feels like, especially from where we sit, that that's a fertile area to discuss further. Maryland and other states really had to improvise a bit to conduct elections during a time when many people, voters, were apprehensive about going out to a public place. Obviously, that was a problem. And I know we talked a lot about that when you first joined virtually back at the onset of the pandemic. What thoughts do you have now on mail-in ballots, drop boxes, other things that have recently become a widespread part of conducting elections and really how people vote?
This has been a nationwide trend, and it's not just the pandemic, although the pandemic brought it to the surface because it created such a temporary reasonable interest in methods of voting that didn't require assembling in one place. But the fact is that these methods are popular and have been catching on, particularly in the West. I'm always fascinated by the fact that once you reach the Rocky Mountains, there's this great willingness to experiment with electoral systems. Most of them have initiative and referendum, which we have only in a very feeble form in Maryland. They pioneered things like the franchise for women and many, many other things, fair redistricting commissions, but Maryland, despite its reputation, is actually in many ways reluctant to try out new things. We did make something of an exception for in recent years, but Maryland has been influenced generally by the liberal objective, which plays itself out nationally and has been influential in Maryland. And just let's create as many avenues as possible. Let's make the deadlines as lenient as possible. The absentee ballot drifts in 7 days after the election, and of course you count it. And if it isn't properly signed, you should go back and find out whether there's a legitimate signature to be had. And most states are not as obliging as that. On the other hand, a lot of states do more with things like lock boxes and early and mail voting. And as I say, I've gone out west to see why not just California, but states like Utah, very conservative states, have found that conservative Republican cultures can often live with and thrive with lock boxes and an emphasis on by mail voting. So that fascinates me. And I actually am hoping that Maryland can learn from some of these things of modernization, because as I say, Maryland still emphasizes, in a way, I like the fact that Maryland emphasizes face-to-face politics. It's part of what makes politics fun here. California doesn't have much face-to-face politics, and when I lived in California, I thought that was a shame. But nonetheless, there's a couple of things going on that I think all the different states have to reckon with. One of them I just mentioned, which is that voters themselves like the convenience. In Utah, they love drop boxes. And I would point out to my conservative friends, lock boxes are a whole lot more secure than voting through the U.S. mail, because you can watch the only place the ballot has been, which you can't with mail voting. So lock boxes have caught on. Conservatives have recognized in many cases in places like Utah that they're actually very efficient. And all of these different states have to recognize that there is a public interest, and there is also a strong voter interest in getting things tabulated quickly. And we all know Maryland, unfortunately, has set a terrible example. Part of it was that silly law we had where you couldn't begin even processing the ballots. You couldn't even begin verifying that it was from an actual voter until 2 days after. Well, we've gotten rid of that, I guess. But we still have a lot of features in Maryland practice and Maryland election law, which put Maryland in the camp of states that don't care all that much, it seems, how rapidly they get a vote done. And, the crisis of the 2020 election should have tipped us all off. But just in general, speaking as someone from Frederick County, where a lot of races had the red mirage,
Right.
an awful lot, and this has been going on in Frederick County for election after election. The Republicans refused to use early and mail voting. Democrats were happy to use it. Those votes were tabulated later. So on election night, it looked as if a bunch of Republican candidates had won, who in fact had lost when the votes were properly counted. That's a needless error. States, both red and blue states, have tightened up their system in ways that they get a substantially complete count, either by election night or maybe by the next morning. And Maryland can too if it tries.
Yes, and I think, with 2020, that was certainly a concern. And, again, politics coming into play and the red and blue, that added to it for sure. And Mako was out front on this and trying to warn folks that we needed to change that law. We finally did. But a lot of it is, like you said, people don't understand. And when they see their guy or their lady winning, and then all of a sudden, when the mail-in votes come in, they are losing and perhaps getting trounced. To them, that seems like there's some conspiracy going on. And so for us and protecting our election officials and workers who have to bear the brunt of that, that was really a central tenet in our argument to fix that law and to make sure that we did have quick turnaround in terms of getting those vote counts complete and making them public. So certainly I agree with you there. I am also fascinated, Walter, with a lot of those Western states and their ability to try new things. Michael and I just got back from a conference with colleagues from Southern states. And I have to tell you, I was surprised to hear a lot of them saying, well, we're not doing ballot drop boxes anymore. Our legislature got rid of that as soon as they could. They don't trust it. But I think you made a really good point there. Whereas if you have a drop box and either it's a locked box or you have a camera feed on it that, is monitored 24/7, that is in many ways more secure than anything else, right? And you have a trail of where that ballot has been, when it was picked up, who handled it. And it went straight to the elections office. So I don't understand. But again, I think that's a lot of it is just people are so embedded now and, mail-in and drop boxes equal fraud that they're not willing to actually take a look at actually what is happening and why it is, in my mind, and sounds like your mind, more secure.
Let me note a trend that could be headed in the right direction, which is there have been a couple of announcements recently that Republican strategists from Washington, D.C. on down have decided that the party made a mistake by discouraging by mail and early voting, and for that matter, lockbox voting, because in fact, you can spread around your resources better. You can run a more effective campaign in many ways. I mean, the Democrats know this. If you already have checked off 30 or 40 or 50% of your voters as having used the early methods, you don't have to do that last minute mailing to them. They've already voted. Save money on mailings. But there are multiple reasons why you just get more bang for the buck out of campaigning if you can get the voters from your party to use early methods, at least some. And so Republicans, who always had reason to know this, and in many cases used to be more effective users of things like absentee voting, it's now becoming more official. Sorry, Donald Trump, we realize you had your say on this, but for the sake of the party, we're going to use these methods too. And that's healthy in a number of different ways, because we ought not to be voting in different ways depending on our political leanings. If 30% want to vote by mail, 30% want to vote in early voting, and 40% on election day, we have a healthier society if each of those different tranches is representative. It not only does it solve the red mirage problem, but it also, potentially relieves one of the types of polarization that leads to suspicion and all the rest.
Absolutely. And that is such a big concern, especially as we near the 2024 election. And staying on this topic, Walter, I want to get into another issue that's really gained a lot of steam nationally and here in Maryland. So this isn't really pandemic related, and I know we've talked about that, but you've written a lot about ranked choice voting as a novel approach to public elections. We did a whole episode on it some time ago, but can you take a minute and tell our listeners where the idea sits now? It has picked up in some places. I know there's a lot of talk about it in Maryland. So in your view, is this an idea? Are you happy with its progress, or are you still out there banging the drum and trying to get people to understand why, in your mind, this is such a wonderful idea?
Well, I do like ranked choice voting, and I speak up for it. And it has made a lot of progress in other states. Maine and Alaska have adopted it statewide, and I think it's up to like 90 cities, including a lot of large cities who've adopted it within the last 5 or 10 years. And I'll tell you a political reality about the cities in particular, which is that ranked choice voting makes no difference across a wide range of elections. In fact, most elections, the same person wins under ranked choice voting than not. Where it makes a big difference is in two scenarios. One of them is where you've got a spoiler party, which might take 4% of the vote, and in doing that, make the difference in a general election. Now, Alaska has had a record of third parties, but let's leave that aside for the moment. Maryland is not a big third party state. The other one is when there is a crowded field, and that's either in a party primary, or in a nonprofit race. Montgomery County, there's a reason why Montgomery County has been asking for ranked choice voting, and Annapolis is, may or may not eventually give its consent in the assembly. But Montgomery County has been asking for it for a long time because it tends to have these Democratic primaries where there are a huge number of candidates, and where there is a very real prospect that someone's going to win. In fact, it has happened in some high-profile races. Someone's going to win with 29% or 31%. And at that point, this gets to be kind of a critical thing. You could have a runoff, maybe, if you're even legally allowed to do a runoff. Runoffs are expensive. Runoffs, you have to get all the volunteers back together in all the schools and all the rest of it. Or you can do this, which is asking people for their second choices. And so if you wonder why the movement for ranked choice voting took off first in Montgomery County and secondarily in Baltimore City, but also in all these cities like New York City and San Francisco and Minneapolis. It's not that it's a super liberal idea. I write about this a lot. You turn around, where did ranked choice voting get its first big footholds? In Ireland and in Australia, which are two countries where conservative parties have done just great over the last century of ranked choice voting. So intrinsically, it's not something that has a bias between left and right. Candidates from both sides can use it, but it's of interest in places where the Democratic primary effectively determines who's going to represent you. And because it so well solves the possibility that someone will slip through in the primary who isn't really the consensus choice of the electorate.
Right. I think the issue is endlessly fascinating. And I guess it's no surprise that some places like Alaska and Maine, who sort of stand out in the Maryland electoral map as being a little more independent and multi-party and maybe more friendly to the wider view here, are the first to go. We've seen a few cities do it, like you mentioned. I don't know if the powers that be in Maryland will ever see a path for it here, but I think it is a really interesting intellectual debate about how to best and most efficiently capture, like you said, a consensus view among the electorate. And it may be that our primary general process is less than perfect in that regard. It's a really interesting sort of navel gazing conversation, and I'm always game for that, even if that's not exactly our brand at Mako. So,
yeah, I mean, and I'll say, Michael, as someone who covers elections for Mako, I mean, I would, if I were a betting man, I would say that Maryland will eventually get there. I think there is a big push among people who do these things every day. I know that there's talk about maybe trying it out in an off year in a county and seeing how it would work. Maryland is going to get a new election system. And I know what Mako has said is that we would prefer if that system can accommodate ranked choice voting moving forward. And I think that's the most important thing now, is that the state get a system that can accommodate that moving forward, if that is the will of the state. We represent 24 jurisdictions. I know that they're all over the map in terms of what they think. So I think a good middle ground for MACo and where we should be is to say, at least make sure that you can accommodate this, in the years ahead before you go out and buy a new system. And it sounds like, Walter, that they are going to do that. They've pledged to do that and make sure that it can. So I do think that eventually the powers that be will give in and try this out at least and see how well it works in Maryland. But you never know. But we've seen it work. I think this has been around maybe since like the 1850s in Europe. So we know that it's worked well there and it has caught on here in Maryland. So we'll see what happens. But certainly you make a good case. And I think you did a good job of explaining those scenarios where it is important and it does matter.
Thank you. I could not agree more. And I think Maryland is not going to have it anytime soon. So the approach that works is the approach you say, which is enable counties and municipalities that want to use it, make sure that the state procured equipment will handle that as well as handling the conventional election method, and then just give the authorizations needed for counties to adopt it if they want. And when we talked about the pandemic, we talked about how the different regions of Maryland have very different political cultures, and this is one of them. The ideas of great interest in some counties are not going to be of interest, at least for a long time, in some others.
So I want to steer back, still on the topic of election administration and policy. There's another facet of this conversation that I think sadly is taking a larger role in talking about our elections. I think people disappointed with the outcome of an election is age old, right? That's a timeless experience, and people being frustrated that their preferred candidate couldn't get that last vote or that last wave of votes to be able to prevail. That's not surprising. What seems to be taking a larger space these days is that angry people upset about the election finding a subject or an object of their frustration in the people who are actually managing and administering, and in many cases even volunteering to support and help the election process themselves. It's been a really big issue in some other states that have been the on the fence states in presidential elections. That's where we've had lots and lots of flashpoints. I have a counterpart from Arizona who herself, her home and family felt threatened because she had a visible role in the election process. Overall, it just seems like it's even tougher to just do your job as an election administrator or even an employee or a volunteer. I mean, do you have thoughts about this trend? It's a pretty unfortunate turn, but it does seem to be happening.
It's so terribly disturbing. And as I go out and meet with election administrators, I mentioned that I've gone out west a couple of times. And this, of course, is always very front of mind because they or people they know have had the death threats, the anonymous calls, the people showing up at their office with no good reason to be there. And one of my old friends is Stephen Richer, who's Maricopa County recorder, and that's the county with Phoenix, and has been just at the center of a whirlwind of this sort of thing. Now, part of this, I look at the root causes and I get new determination to try to address some of the problems of mass misinformation and mass polarization and loss of trust in institutions. But then there's the specific policy question of, in the meantime, what, if anything, can we do for these particular employees of a county or another jurisdiction that are dealing with this, especially during election season. And I still remember the county election administrator who said that there was such a difference between having just how the parking lot was laid out, because in election season, when there were too many people coming to work for the parking lot to accommodate, they would have to walk to street parking. And it was then that they would be shouted at and terrible names called them. And, they were asked, why they were on the take of George Soros or whatever the thing was. And the people would quit, quit in large numbers or, set up convoys to walk to their cars or walk out to a restaurant for lunch. this is no way to have elections. And I know, if there were a historian here, they'd say, oh, wait till you hear about 19th century America where people were attacked at the polls all the time. I don't want to go back to people being attacked at the polls. I thought we had gotten past, all that sort of thing. The things that I always took for granted about American elections, I feel I can no longer take for granted, such as the basic safety of those who administer them. Now, having said that, I work on First Amendment issues a lot. And when you try to pass laws in this area, you have to be very aware that you are coming up often right up to the line of what courts view as core political speech. We've seen this in the abortion clinic protest cases, which never seem to entirely get settled. They have had multiple visits to the courts. And we've seen them in some other areas because the sidewalks are generally open to the public. The right to scream terrible insults at people based on political antipathy for them, as opposed to other motives, it tends to draw protection from the courts. And so, and some other issues that come up, such as protecting the names or addresses of election workers. Well, the state can do some things where it isn't raising First Amendment issues, such as simply withdraw from its own directories in many cases. It's now standard security practice at many companies not to put faces next to names for a lot of in public-facing employee directories, just to cut down on identity theft and a bunch of other things. Well, so there's some things like that where you can help protect the workers. On the other hand, there are people drafting laws saying that it's illegal for private citizen A to do a social media post saying, you realize that this is the address or the name. And there, of course, you immediately get into a long chain of First Amendment cases, which tends to require that the person have gone further than that, but there be a threat, for example. But in the absence of a threat, you might not be able to restrict the exchange of information combined with terrible insults about some of the people who make our elections work.
Right. I think the context for you to make a comment about people coming to the elections office with no real reason to be there, with your point of view, thinking very deeply about the First Amendment and making sure that people's core political views are protected. I mean, the right to redress your government is fundamental in the construct of our nation. So the notion that folks advance this as far as a threat, I think, is troubling even to people who champion free speech and that sort of thing. So, we've been in the middle of a political debate in Maryland. We've seen proposed legislation to say there are special protections if you threaten an elected official. If you tell your senator, I'm so mad you voted for that bill, we're going to come and pick it in front of your house and threaten your family, that's not just violence against the senator, but it's also sort of violence against the democracy. And I think we at MACO believe there's a similar argument. If you tell the election administrator, you're a crook, you're in cahoots, and I'm going to threaten your home and family, that's sort of a threat against the conduct of fair elections, in addition to the administrator herself. I know that toes the line on those issues of free speech, but I'd like to thread that needle. I think we owe our election volunteers and leaders that much.
And the whole question of showing up at people's homes is a flashpoint not just on this specific election issue, but as you know, Maryland has been the scene of a lot of controversy because several Supreme Court justices in the U.S. Supreme Court live in Maryland. And demonstrators have shown up in their homes. And of course, we all had to pay attention when an actual assassin showed up and got into, I guess, Justice Kavanaugh's home, diffused without incident. But as I understand it, Montgomery County has a law that they are not fully enforcing that could be used to provide better security for the justices. Having said that, I have to go back and say the opposite, which is here in Frederick County, it might be hard to believe, but we have had demonstrations at elected officials' houses. So far as I could tell, they were not as threatening as they would have to be in order to trigger the threat element in which you lose First Amendment protection. But I tried to make sure that they felt the weight of social pressure, that people who might agree with them on this specific issue that they were upset about, nonetheless felt that it crossed a line of practice and approval to go to an elected official's home, that they were going to lose their support on the underlying issue if they tried that sort of nonsense.
I think that's a great point. And I'll just say it's been incredibly frustrating. This is, you mentioned it earlier, you have a lot of people who are just quitting, and the amount of institutional knowledge that has walked out the door in Maryland is astounding. And a lot of it is because of the climate that we're in, right? And so I know there is a lot of stuff that's in the weeds, but I think a reasonable and rational person would say there is a line, and if you cross that line, you should be held accountable for it. And I think this is a humongous threat to democracy when you have people scared to go to work. The people who administer our elections are the backbone of our democracy. We've got to find a way to thread that needle. It's been challenging here in Maryland, and I know it's a lot of the nuance that causes that challenge. But still, I think rational and reasonable people would say we have to do something to make sure that these folks don't feel threatened to go to work, that we can still recruit and retain people like election judges that are essential, again, to our democracy. Nobody wants to show up in an environment like that, where you have to walk to work from your car and you're getting harassed and people are threatening your families. I know free speech is absolutely fundamental to our democracy, but so are free and fair elections. So in my mind, we have to get this right. We have to thread the needle. This is happening in Maryland. We've had in Carroll County recently, they received an envelope full of powder. Obviously, that was meant as a threat. Turned out to be like Dorito shavings or something, But again, just the act of doing something like that is obviously meant to intimidate and threaten. And unfortunately, it's worked in a lot of instances because we've had a lot of people retire or leave election work because they don't want to deal with it. So I'm hopeful we can do that. Some states have. I'm hopeful that we'll get there here in Maryland, doing it the right ways, pulling the right levers, making sure that we're not infringing on free speech. But again, there has to be a line.
We haven't mentioned a related issue that people are also torn about, which is where and to what extent can there be any remedy to lying about elections. And again, you look to the court cases to find out how the courts apply the First Amendment. There was one earlier this year in which the message was effectively to give people misinformation about how to cast a vote, so as to draw some of them into thinking that they had voted when they had not. And the court ruled that it was okay to apply criminal liability to that. I don't think the courts are going to go too much further than that. There is a lot of question about, shouldn't unreasonably denying the results of elections be made criminal in some way. I don't think that would be a good extension of the law, even though I'm very critical of the people that are targeted here. But where the courts often look to issues like imminence, is this something that's just about to happen? Did it happen like the day before the election? Is it something that would potentially fool people about the mechanisms of voting, like telling them that they're not qualified to vote and would be turned away if they came to the election polls? That's been used as a tactic in some last-minute underhanded campaigns. And so the courts will probably allow there to be some nipping away at the most imminent, most misleading lying about elections. But otherwise, we are probably just stuck with the fact that there are lots of lies, and we're going to have to go on listening to them for a long time.
And I do want to get more into the courts, Walter. I do have one more question for you on this issue. So AI deepfakes, that's a thing now, and it's going to be a problem when it comes to elections. People can create AI depictions of people saying things that they never really said, and they look incredibly real, right? And I know the FCC has recently moved forward, at least on a public comment period, for trying to regulate AI deepfakes, especially when it comes to elections. But where do you see this going, Walter? This is an incredibly novel area when it comes to law, and I don't know necessarily if there is a nut to crack here and how we can prevent these types of deepfakes, particularly when they are trying to disenfranchise voters and providing bad information, but also for, if I'm running as a candidate and all of a sudden all these videos are popping up of me on social media saying things that I never said. and they're ubiquitous. I mean, how do we deal with that? And where is the line there?
The most wishful answer is we should all be better social media consumers and not just be so eager to bite the line when some candidate that we dislike appears to have done something or said something ridiculously unlikely. And I'll drop that because I know that we're not all going to reform, and if we do, it doesn't save the rest of the social media consumers. The current set of laws is only going to reach certain situations, and even those ones is often going to reach too late to do much good. And in particular, if it's actual commercial advertising, then sometimes the FTC or the Federal Elections Commission can reach it. A lot of this stuff is not paid advertising. It's done by someone out to create mischief, or maybe someone who thinks they're being funny. That's actually the source of a lot of very damaging political misinformation, is someone who isn't particularly attached to a campaign, but just thinks, ha, 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 but my friends would laugh if I had person X saying thing Y. And before long, something has escaped and gone viral. And so you've got so-called rights of publicity, which is a type of lawsuit people can file when their image is used in association with things that they never actually believed. Well, good luck getting a court ruling a year and a half later after the election against someone anonymously who may not even be in the United States. They're very, very inadequate remedies. Likewise, defamation. Well, you can try. These sometimes will have some value if you're using them against your actual election opponent or some other person who has something to lose. But part of what makes the social media environment so treacherous is that so many of the threats come from people who may not have anything to lose. They may be teenagers in a basement. They may be in other countries. And so as you say, we are headed rapidly toward toward a situation in which not just a 5-second news clip, but even a 20-minute speech could be delivered by a plausible talking replica of a major public figure saying things that they don't actually believe. And because of artificial intelligence, it will be done cleverly in many instances, copying the sorts of way they would talk, perhaps putting in a whole bunch of things they actually do believe, and then the one thing that is true, such as an endorsement of someone that the confabulator wants you to think they endorsed. The equivalent is already basically being done in print campaign brochures, and that goes back a long way. Misleading use of photographs and things in order to make it look as if you've got an endorsement from someone that has not actually chosen to endorse you. That's an old problem, and we now have new technology to make it much more powerful.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, the remedies aren't swift in these scenarios, so I think we're going to have to rely on these social media platforms to do some self-regulating, and we know it hasn't gone so well in the past, but hopefully we can rein this in a little bit, because I am super concerned about this as we reach the 24 election.
I am very critical of Twitter, which I guess I'm supposed to call X, on many other grounds. But I will say they have this thing called community notes, in which they essentially crowdsource people to say, hey, this isn't actually Nancy Pelosi, or whatever the issue is. And surprising me, and I think surprising almost everyone, it has actually turned out to be a more effective way of tagging misinformation than the ways we were used to, in which you have to get what may be a 10,000 employee company to, and these are like battleships. You can get quick action or you can get good action, but it's very hard to get action that's both quick and good on the moderation front. But even community notes at Twitter won't work if you are the sort of person who forwards it 5 seconds after you see it. So again, I urge people to be the kind of social media consumer who says, gee, that's interesting. I think I'll come back in 12 hours and see if there's a community note pasted on it. And maybe at that point, if there isn't, treat it as trustworthy enough to share. That trigger finger in sharing is the cause of so many of our woes.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. So hopefully we'll be able to thread that needle as well. But Walter, I do want to pivot back to the courts. And we've seen election issues in the courts, as you've mentioned. The Supreme Court of the United States has weighed in on district drawing, and we know that's been an issue that's close to your heart as well. This isn't necessarily a partisan setting. That's not really our brand. But what do you see from the courts as they set limits on the process beneath the surface for elections? Again, this is an issue in many states, and there are a lot of viewpoints here as to whether the court should be weighing in and you know, the way that they're weighing it, of course. So where do you see things now, Walter? What's the landscape from where you sit?
With the federal courts, they have divided it neatly between racial cases where they remain very active. They continue to take and hear cases where gerrymandering is alleged on the basis of race versus political gerrymandering, and where they have now committed themselves to the view, and I don't see that changing anytime soon, that the courts would not be competent at trying to correct purely political gerrymandering done for the benefit of candidates and parties, but not done on the basis of race. Now, there remains the fact that there are all of these mixed cases, like the one that they'll be hearing from South Carolina momentarily, in which one party says, look at this is obviously dividing the voters by race. And the other one says, well, that's just incidental. We were trying to divide them between Republicans and Democrats. And, you know, in South Carolina, that's just the way that it happens. And so the court, you know, can't really keep itself from getting into some of these mixed motive issues. But in the meantime, it's pretty determined to have given a final message for now. What a way to put it, final message for now, that it's not going to interfere with political gerrymandering. That leaves the state Supreme Courts. And of course, Maryland has contributed to what is a nationwide trend of state Supreme Courts very often saying, you know, we're not going to wait around forever for the U.S. Supreme Court to find in the Constitution a prohibition on partisan gerrymandering. We're going to find it in our state constitution. And that happened very notably in states like North Carolina and Pennsylvania and others. And it happened very notably with Judge Patelia in the congressional case here. And so I know we probably don't want to get drawn into the whole question of to what extent her lengthy, impressive opinion is going to count as precedent next time. We can save that for another show if you want. But Maryland is very much going to be one of the states to watch, precisely because there is a legislature that has given off signals that it's going to ignore that decision and treat it as non-presidential. You know, it will go undoubtedly to a different judge or different judges next time. We're still years away from that, but it's not too early to say that people will be watching Maryland for the next cycle.
So Walter, we really appreciate you getting us into election policy and some legal and practical perspectives. This is exactly what we were looking for. Always interested in hearing some of your points of view. I'm a regular reader of the material that you seem like an endless font of interesting things in the internet space. So while you're here, you've got our audience that we've gathered. They are smart, inquisitive people who are interested in state and local policy. Anything else that you'd like to take a moment to share with our teeming millions of Conduit Street fans?
Well, thank you, Michael. A lot of what I'm writing about these days doesn't have very much of a Maryland angle. In particular, I'm writing about former President Trump's legal woes with the 4 indictments. How could a legal writer resist the endless mine of material that those 4 cases present? And also, if you want to think of it as case number 5, the controversy about whether Section 3 of the 14th Amendment might bar him from running again on the grounds that he supported insurrection against the government. And it is an absolutely fascinating intellectually. I had dismissed that initially as too much of a long shot. And then I actually read the 90-page article that originalist legal scholars who, like me, are members of the Federalist Society, wrote. And it was really impressive. You know, I didn't realize the extent to which it had been established back in post-Civil War days that you didn't have to be at the front lines. You didn't have to be shooting. Even just giving moral support to people at the front lines was enough to be disqualified in the view of some of the people who brought us the amendment. So it made it a much more open question. And I've written a little, we will all be watching very closely. This is very likely to be resolved in the courts. And I'll just say, I hope we get a clear reading from the federal courts and specifically the Supreme Court sooner rather than later. No one wants to go deep into 2024 not knowing how that set of cases will turn out.
And Walter, I know that the Secretary of State here in Maryland, Susan Lee, has hinted that she is considering whether or not to ban former President Trump from the ballot in the primary. So my concern there is, I just, again, back to our election folks, worry about what would happen, and would people show up in droves and be protesting outside of local election offices, and just adding to this toxic atmosphere. I don't know. I'm not deep into the legal theory here. I know certain states are going to test this. I mean, are you worried about that at all in terms of what that would mean and the outrage that it would cause among certain groups of people?
Yes, I am worried, because there are a few things that would be more received as a provocation than trying to keep their guy off the ballot. They would view it as a confirmation of all of the things they've been saying about the East Coast elite, assuming this happens on the East Coast, and how they don't want a fair election and they want to rig things. And you can write the lines yourself. Of the different ways it could reach the Supreme Court, I'm kind of hoping that it's in something like a context of someone asking for a declaratory judgment, just saying, not trying to get one result or the other, just asking the courts to clarify what the rights are. On the other hand, it's possible, I'd half jokingly say Rhode Island ought to step forward, because people are going to correctly view it as a test case most accurately if it's a very small state and no one is in any dispute about how it would come out in the presidential election. There have been presidential elections in which some of the two leading candidates have not made it onto the ballots of all states. If Rhode Island doesn't volunteer, Maryland certainly counts as being a state where there's no suspense as to the outcome. But it's, I think your warning is very right. The stakes are very high here, because you are trying to get the surgery right very near one of the most vital processes of all, which is the right of the voters to choose their candidates.
We'll leave it there. Walter Olson, it's always such a pleasure to have you on. And Walter, you again with the Cato Institute, you write a lot about legal issues, and you work at the Robert E. Levy Center for Constitutional Studies. So you write a lot on law, public policy, regulation. I'm a big follower. You have a great social media presence as well. Remind folks how they can follow you on Twitter. And yes, this is a safe space. We are never going to call it X on this podcast, as far as I'm concerned. So Twitter and other ways people can read what you write, Walter, and follow you.
Okay. On Twitter, I am Walter Olson. That's Olson, just like my name. You can also find me on Threads and Blue Sky, and I'm quite active on those two platforms. Love to get some more Maryland people onto those two platforms to get some local discussions going. And if you go to cato.org and look at the list of scholars, this is only for people who want a big dose of my writing. But you and pull down my personal page there, you will see the hundreds and hundreds of articles, including a fair number on Maryland-specific things, because I just can't resist, even though that website is aimed at a national audience. Maryland is very often doing things that people in other states would want to know about. I just wrote about the Maryland Higher Education Commission and its process of having to give permission before universities can start new degree programs. So far as I know, there is no other state that has exactly that system. And people in other states were fascinated when I wrote a critical article about the Maryland way.
Yes, and a lot of what you've talked about today, there are extensive pieces on the Cato site that people can read more about that. I'm hopeful that we'll get you back on. I know you're a busy guy, but we have so much to talk about. I'm super interested in your take on elections, and I think we covered that thoroughly today. Michael, any closing thoughts from you before we wrap here with Walter Olson?
No, I think you undersell yourself. You're saying only if you want the volume of stuff. We've got listeners to this podcast who are exactly that person. And they'll be clicking and they'll be looking. So prepare the Cato website for a barrage of interested people from Maryland.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Well, we will leave it there today. Thank you again to Walter Olson. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all of these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, you should be reading the Conduit Street blog. But we will post links for everything Walter just said, how to find him on the website, how to follow him on social. We'll put those in the show notes. But for Walter Olson and Michael Sanderson, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.